I remember I hired my first person a number of years ago, and that's what I was told is at the end of the process, then just go with your gut, go with who you're most comfortable with. And I'm thinking, well, I'm an organizational psychologist. We tried to turn this into more of a, kind of a scientific kind of thing. And then at the end of it, you're telling me just to go with my gut. I thought it was a bad idea then, and I think it's even a worse idea now.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, president of Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. And this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Please follow, rate, and review Good Morning HR wherever you get your podcast. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or at goodmorninghr.com. For many hiring authorities, evaluating a job candidate starts with looking at their recent job titles, making sure they have the right education, and maybe looking for an industry-specific certification. And then they select the candidate that their gut tells them is the best hire. But in an age of title inflation, does job title really tell you much about what the individual's role really was, or that they were even competent in that role? Or is a 15-year-old degree necessarily indicative that the candidate's knowledge is up to date? And let's face it, maintaining many certifications after you've received them doesn't really require that you demonstrate that you actually learned anything in all of those continuing education courses. My guest today points to what he says is a better way to select candidates. Mark Smith is the principal consultant at A Better Choice Hire. Mark holds a Ph.D. in industrial organization psychology and has spent his career researching and consulting with firms like Gartner and SHRM. He has presented expert testimony about skills-based hiring to the U.S. House Committee on Education and the Workforce, and has collaborated with the National Academy of Science on the future of work. And he is the author of the recent best-selling book, A Better Choice, The Manager's Guide to Skills-First Hiring. He and his wife are also accomplished ballroom dancers, and they have performed with the Virginia Ballet Company. Welcome to Good Morning HR, Mark.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate you having me, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Okay, I want to start off with the total non-HR part, the dancing. So you're a ballroom dancer, and I know when you say the Nutcracker, I know one of the performances you did was the Nutcracker, so that means you were in the party scene at the beginning doing the dancing there, right?
That's right. Yeah, you're obviously familiar with it.
Oh, I am too familiar. My 23-year-old son dances with the Norwegian National Ballet, and 10 years ago, he was the Nutcracker, and they needed adults to dance in the opening party scene.
Uh-huh.
And I mean, I can't even play the radio. I have no musical ability or timing or anything, but my son was the Nutcracker, and they needed, parents to do that. It was the hardest thing I've done in my entire life. All that ballroom dancing. I have so much more respect for what he does and what you do. And I'm just glad that I don't fall down walking down the stairs. But it was, so we've got that in common. You were successful at it, and I didn't kill me. So
fantastic. Yeah, our group in Virginia, we've got so many dads who are engaged in the studio and happy to help. It's just so much fun.
It's fun, but boy, is it painful when you look at, I thought I was smiling throughout it, because you see the photos and I think I've got this down, and I've got this beautiful little 15-year-old girl who my job is not to make her look stupid. And so I'm doing good. I haven't messed anything up. And I think I'm smiling and all that. And I see all the photos after, and I'm like, just teeth bared, just gritting through it. But I didn't make her look too bad. And now she dances with the Oklahoma City Ballet. So she, because of me, she got that much better to cover my deficits, right?
So, well, fantastic. Yeah.
So talking about skills, let's talk about skills first hiring. What do you mean by the skills first part of that?
Yeah. So when I talk about skills first hiring, it's really making sure that we're evaluating candidates directly based on the skills that are relevant for the job. Which sounds pretty obvious, right? I say that and virtually everybody nods their head in agreement. And so that's not contentious. it can be difficult, but everybody agrees that that's an ideal approach. But when you take it a step further and you say, well, largely college degrees are not good predictors of who will be a good job performer. And really, things like years of experience, you really have to take those with a grain of salt as well. And those have been, as you say, the real core of evaluating candidates for a number of years, education and years of experience. And I'm saying we can directly evaluate skills, knowledge, competencies a lot better than just looking at whether somebody has a degree and how many years of experience they have.
And you use that, we've talked a lot about skills-based hiring, and you use skills-first hiring, and maybe that's more branding, but I really like the idea that we're starting from a point of competencies and ability to do that job ahead of credentials that that maybe don't have always a direct correlation or causation to success.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And largely we're talking about the same thing when we talk about skills-based hiring versus skills-first hiring. I think skills-first is a just better term that more accurately describes what we're talking about.
How long has that approach been? I mean, I came out of healthcare HR before I started my consulting firm 25 years ago, and we were dealing with competencies then, right?
Right.
That was, and I think healthcare was one of the early industries that really developed the competencies model. And certainly when we were bringing clinicians in, people like that, we were testing their competencies before we ever set them loose on patients. But how is, from the 25 years ago when it was healthcare and maybe a few others, how has that evolved, and where are we now, do you think, in evaluating skills as the most, the leading part of selecting our candidates?
Yeah, and I think the idea behind the competency-based hiring and the competency-focused work, it was always a good idea. The competencies themselves often got a little funny, where the names got weird and very idiosyncratic by companies, and different sort of like unrelated skills and abilities and things just started to get mushed together under these sort of broad terms that we called competencies. So the idea behind it, I thought, was a good one. In practice, things got a little impractical. I think when we're talk about skills first hiring, it's taken that competency based work and improving on it, standardizing some things, but importantly, it's doing it in a way that I think is much more measurable. Because when we talk about skills and we talk about knowledge and we talk about abilities, those are the real important things that we're evaluating. A lot of those can be effectively evaluated with psychometric assessment and other types of assessment. And so instead of having these competencies that were very kind of loose frameworks of things that were all important, but I don't know that they were organized that well in a lot of cases. And in many cases, it ended up being an interview or a series of interviews that folks really use to measure those. With the skills first approach, I think we can do a much better job measuring the important competencies and personality traits, as well as the skills and the knowledge.
So before we get too deep into that, you mentioned college degrees earlier, and I'll just, state my biases right up front is that I think probably 60% of the people that are going to college probably ought not. What it costs and what the return on investment is, and the ability to develop the skills directly in the workplace or through a certification program or something like that. But so tell me your take. I mean, to those of us with 15, 16, 17-year-old students out there who are marginally academically inclined, they'll do the homework, they'll do the basics, but they don't have a real passion. What's your take on where do you really encourage somebody to chase a college degree versus some other kind of learning?
Yeah, and college has gotten a little weird in terms of the purpose that it is serving. For so many 18-year-olds, it's the default. Well, of course I'll go to college next, and then it's, well, what do you want to do with your career? Is the question, and it ends up being, I'll figure that out when I'm there, which it's essentially what I did, and so I totally get it. But as you say, from a return on investment perspective, and just does this make sense from a time and resource? Largely, the answer is no. Now, if you know you want to go into a technical kind of field, you probably are going to have to get a college degree. If you know you want to be a doctor or a lawyer, I don't think college degrees are going anywhere for those folks. If you aren't sure, or you think you want to go into some other things, then we really need to have the discussion of, is college right? And I've been having discussions with students, because I think, as you had stated, I have a daughter who's going to be a sophomore in high school, and so we're having these discussions, in terms of visiting colleges and stuff. And she's smart, and I think she's college is the appropriate place for her, but I can't run counter to what I'm making the case for in the book, which is it's not for everybody. It's just, it's not serving students well when too many come out with 6 figures of college debt, and the degree is just not a degree that is actually going to get them into a job that they couldn't have gotten otherwise.
Right. There's no market demand for, we don't need as many English majors. I've got no problem with English majors. But, there's just not that many straight writing jobs out there. And being, like you said, like we've talked about, being an English major and having that degree doesn't mean you're a good writer either. So, it's those competencies are, there's maybe a disconnect there. What kind of employers are you seeing primarily focusing on skills first hiring? Is this mostly employers who, after 2021, just couldn't find qualified people, and so they're looking for alternatives, or is this a bigger trend?
I think, yes, it's I have a hard time finding people with my traditional approach. Now, I've seen some research out there about the use of skills-based or skills-first hiring, and some of this research has said, oh yeah, virtually everybody's on board with it, and maybe everybody is sort of going to voice their support of it. But if you look at the job postings, and LinkedIn has done some of this research the last few years, if you look at the job postings, what % of them are still kind of demanding a college degree or a specific college degree? That % has gone down, but it's gone down marginally. It's gone down by like 2% in the last couple of years, which is probably trending in the right direction. But to say that everybody's on board with this and this is how it's going to go, yeah, that's not necessarily the case. From the organization's perspective, I think a lot of times it becomes, a very kind of practical decision to use something like a college degree to screen applicants, especially when you talk to companies, especially those who are hiring remote positions. So they'll put their job posting out on Indeed, and they'll list it on LinkedIn, and the first day they'll get hundreds of applicants, and hundreds of applicants, not just random applicants, but people who have some reason to believe that they would like the job or be a good fit for the job. And if they leave it up for a couple of days, some of them will easily get 1,000 applicants. That is too many to deal with. And so these companies need some way to call that down. Okay, I can't deal with 1,000. I can't even deal with 250. So how do I get that down? And so it becomes a real practical kind of issue.
One of the things I really liked about the book was that you focus on not just those technical skills, but also soft skills or people skills. I had Daryl Lowens on the podcast a month or two ago where we talked about soft skills and emotional intelligence and, whether you call them people skills or, soft skills. And I think they're, again, the hard skills.
Right.
I think they're really important. Kind of give me your elevator pitch for why we should be concerned about those.
Yeah. So, when I go into companies and I'm talking to folks, and a lot of times we'll do a job analysis, and as part of the job analysis, I'll always ask, okay, what does it take for somebody to get fired from this job? And I know, that type of thing is fairly rare, but what does it take for someone to get fired from this job? And largely it's going to be they don't get along with people. They're a bad fit from a personality perspective. They don't communicate well. Almost never do you hear, oh, they didn't have the knowledge or the skills. They didn't have the ability to learn. If that's the case, they're probably pushing them through training. So when people are really a bad enough fit that they're exiting a company because of it, it's these soft skills. And when I say soft skills, I don't mean to imply that they're, unimportant or easy. In fact, they're the most difficult ones. And so the real key is how to evaluate those things when you're evaluating the candidates, and not just focus on the hard skills, which are really, in a lot of cases, the easier things to evaluate.
Mm-hmm. You do a really good job in the book of moving through a process from identifying that you need to fill this position and what this position really should look like, all the way to onboarding. So and so I really recommend the book for anybody in HR who's looking at revamping their process, but also those frontline managers who are interviewing and thinking, often the ones who are tasked with writing the job descriptions and conducting a lot of the interviews. So would you kind of walk through as we're, what those big steps are about developing a skills-based hiring process?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. I really, when I was writing the book, was really thinking of the hiring managers as I was writing this. I'm thinking, this may be a little remedial for some HR folks, but when we're talking to hiring managers, that's where I get pushback on certain things. And so in the book, we'll talk about, think of the hiring process as a funnel where you've got the most people at the top of it, and then the things at the top of the funnel have to be designed to deal with a relatively large volume of people. And so you want those to be as touchless as possible. And then as you go down through the process, you can have things that are more person intensive. And so at the very top of the funnel these days, we can have some computer assessments. And those computer assessments, as long as somebody sort of meets some very minimal standards, you can immediately push them through the computer assessments. When I started in this field, 20 plus years ago, we were just starting to do computer assessments, and it was very difficult to really think of, wait, I'm just hiring one person. I can't do a computer assessment of 100 at the very top of the funnel. And so naturally, the assessment was much further down in the funnel. These days, a recruiter doesn't have to look at the resume or consider the person at all. You can immediately push them through some sort of ability or skill or personality or a combination of all those types of assessments. And that's how I think we can really get from the 1,000 people to a much more manageable number.
And I think because unfortunately, and I've said this for years, every hiring manager, or a lot of the hiring managers, think they've got this unique insight into the human soul, and that their gut is going to direct them into, finding the right candidate. And they've got all these weird, nice to haves that they really, whenever I see nice to have, I know this is the thing that managers putting at the top of their list, but they know they're not supposed to. And, they've got their own processes. But if they really want to do a skills first type approach, I think the first thing, and you say in the book, is really examine what you need, do the task analysis. What does this person have to do in this role? What do they have to be able to demonstrate? Would you kind of walk through figuring that out and taking those tasks to the technical and soft skills that they need, and kind of figuring out what do we really want to look for in this position?
Right. Yeah. So that occurs often before there's even a job opening or a job posting. And so that's the job analysis. And a lot of times there's a job and sort of organization analysis going on. And we talked about competencies before, and often that's where competencies would come in. But I really, whenever I do these, I need to start my job analysis with the tasks, the things that the person in this job is actually doing. Because largely there's no disagreement about that. Everybody can agree, okay, yeah, this person is responsible to do these 10 things. And once we start getting into, okay, what does it take to do those things, which is the next step in terms of determining the skills and the knowledge and the abilities and such, let's start a place where everybody can agree, which is, okay, the person in this job does X, Y, and Z, and everybody agrees on that. And then we really nail those down, and then we go from there. And when we go from there, and then we can start talking about the skills and the knowledge. And even there, I want to attach the skills that we're talking about to the duties, to the tasks that I know are actually part of the job. And so when it comes out, oh, we need somebody who has this skill, then you can say, okay, that may be perfectly appropriate. What task do they need that skill for? And then sometimes we refer to those as linkages. I need to make sure all these things have linkages. And especially on the knowledge and the skills side, once I've identified those things with linkages, then determining the tests and stuff, that actually becomes much easier, because we can use what we'll call a content validation approach. Sometimes I call it a job content validation approach with the tests, to make sure that the skills and the knowledge on the tests are actually done on the job. And again, we can talk about linkages. So we can link the tests to the actual content of the job. And that becomes maybe not a bulletproof validation approach, but a very strong validation approach, that if this thing was ever challenged, at least in the US, if it was ever challenged legally, you absolutely have a great place to start. The content validation approach doesn't work so well for personality assessments or for underlying abilities, which get a little further away from the job. But from a knowledge test, from a skills test perspective, that's a great place to start.
And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. HR leaders are often approached by other parts of the organization with a request that they run a background check on someone for a legitimate business purpose, but not an employment-related purpose. And because the laws regarding employment-related background checks are totally different from any other kind of background check, and most employment background screening companies won't even run other kinds of checks, the HR professionals think they have to say no. While for the last 25 years, Imperative has been the best source for employers who want to make well-informed hiring decisions, we also provide a variety of other due diligence background investigations for businesses. So whether your company needs to check out a potential service provider, needs help with a due diligence on an investment or acquisition, or maybe your legal department needs a litigation-related background investigation, Imperative is here to help. You can learn more at imperativeinfo.com. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 1/2 hour of recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Research Credits. Then select episode 159 and enter the keyword Skills First. That's all one word, SKILLSFIRST. And if you're looking for even more recertification credit, check out the webinars page at imperativeinfo.com. And now back to my conversation with Mark Smith. We recently had Brandon Jordan on the podcast to talk about the effective use of behavioral assessments to identify the candidates' behavioral styles. And I've been a big advocate. Well, actually, when I was in frontline HR in the 90s, we tested some behavioral assessments back then and couldn't find.
Right.
We just, the correlations, the quality and ability to do them, especially back in pen and paper test, just weren't nearly as good as what we have now. But for the last 15, 20 years, I've been a big advocate for them. And I think there's a lot of value there. But I think one of the stumbling blocks a lot of employers have in evaluating those more technical skills is how do I do that effectively in a productive way that doesn't take a ton of time? So what kind of tools are out there for somebody who wants to be able to measure someone's ability to reconcile, accounts, in a certain software or something like that in a technical role?
Yeah. So there are a lot of good tests that are off the shelf these days. And in the last 5 or 10 years, there have been a lot of new companies, which I think of them as platform first testing companies. 20 years ago, all the testing companies were content first testing companies. But, as we evolved and this became, a technical problem with a technical solution, a lot of the old companies that had a lot of paper tests, they didn't have a good technical solution. And so a lot of these newer companies, and I work with one of them, they have like engineering at their core, and they can offer great solutions. And then we can really look at the test content separate from them. So personality assessments can be very useful. And 20 years ago, as you were talking, I think both the nature of some of the tests that were out there and the maturity of the research the maturity of the research. We hadn't really done many meta-analysis at that point, and a lot of times, what we would find in our validation studies is maybe there's a relationship, but it's really small if there is one. And then once we're able to put things together in meta-analysis, we can say, okay, there is a relationship. It's not a huge relationship, but there is a relationship. What becomes interesting, and I think hiring managers will often pick up on this and may not really know how to articulate it, is the impact of faking on these things. So, I can measure conscientiousness, and there are a number of good measures of conscientiousness. And broadly speaking, I can say conscientiousness is important for virtually any job. Do you show up on time? Do you work hard? Are you willing to follow the rules? These types of things. That's important for almost any job. And personality tests exist for these things that can measure those fairly well. But what happens when somebody is in a situation where they're applying for the job? They know maybe they're really not very high in conscientiousness, but they want the job. And so what are they going to do when you give them some items that they know are job related, and they also know that they're not particularly high on?
They're going to tell you they're going to guess what you want the answer to be.
Right. Right. And some of the times the guessing is tricky. And other times it's, I'm a hard worker. And you go, that's not a tricky one to fake. And I've seen that item on a number of different personality assessments. So yeah.
And some of the better tests, I think, identify where people are, are playing with, trying to, be less than sincere in their responses. But I think it also takes a certain amount of self-awareness to really, somebody who's not high in self-awareness may see themselves in a way that they're really not. And maybe really, they're being honest. They think they're, that they're a very sociable, outgoing person who, and they're responding that way. And in reality, that's not who they are. And so I think, how do you, Do you find people when they're developing these skills based kind of testing, is there a problem there with people trying to fake it, or those skills either you've got them or you don't, and so they're harder to fake?
Yeah, for the skills, for the knowledge, and largely with the abilities, you don't really you worry about people cheating those more than people faking those. And so that's where, when we're talking about computer assessments, become more worried about, okay, do I need a proctor for this? And that's another thing that just in the past few years, proctoring, whether you're using a live sort of remote human proctor or an AI proctor, it become much better, much more usable, much cheaper than it ever was before.
The system we use actually for because we have a pretty skills intensive hiring process, because there's no college degree that prepares you for what my analysts do all day, and we'll train them, but they've got to have certain skill. They've got to be able to communicate in English at a pretty high level, problem solve using the internet and other tools. And so we've built out our system, and the system that we use also while they're doing, especially on the narrative where I'm asking them to write and respond to prompts, it captures, with fully telling them in advance, it captures an image of them, every 2 seconds while they're doing that. So I can see, and I can also see if their software loses focus. So if their browser window they're working on loses focus, in other words, they open another app or they go to another tab, it flags me to that issue. What other tools are there to kind of, you mentioned proctoring, are there other tools out there that help prevent cheating on those?
Well, and so more recently has been the AI proctoring, and even a few years ago, right during COVID, this came to the front for a lot of people when it came to colleges and testing. And so professors were they couldn't have in-person classes. And so then it's, okay, how do I administer these exams? And then companies said, oh, we've got this AI proctoring that you can use. And without a human evaluating the things, a lot of times the AI was flagging stuff that really wasn't cheating, pissed a lot of people off, probably a bad idea. Even in the last 3 or 4 years, things have improved since then. Still, you probably shouldn't outsource the proctoring entirely to AI. I think as you pointed out, you can have them recorded. And so then if the AI says, I think we have a problem here, you don't just immediately call somebody a cheater and throw them out. You actually have a person look at it and say, okay, does this look like they're actually doing something, untoward or bad or anything along those lines?
So for these, do these software programs that people are accessing to measure this stuff, how much of it needs to be bespoke to that certain job, and how much time does the hiring manager or HR ever have to create the inputs for the test relative to that job versus what they can just pull off the shelf and select from a menu?
When I'm thinking about the hiring process, and as I talked about before, the funnel and the things at the top of the funnel, unless you're a really big company who has a position that you have a ton of applicants for, it doesn't make sense to do these custom tests that you're using at the top. There are a lot of available tests that are similar enough to most jobs that can do the job. The next step in the hiring process, well, there may be a couple of things in there in terms of a realistic job preview and some other communications with folks. But if they pass the computer test, if they decide that they still want to be in the hiring process, then we can get to the interviews. And when I talk about interviews, I'm specifically talking about structured interviews. So we get to the structured interview part, and that's when I start really advocating the specific things that you need for the job, and those become much easier to modify and tweak in a live way. But again, it can't be an unstructured kind of thing. It has to be structured. And when I say structured, I mean the different applicants get the same basic questions, and the different candidates are evaluated in the same way. And so we have structure in terms of the questions that are asked, and we also have structure in terms of how their responses are evaluated.
Yeah. That's I've been a big advocate for that for a long time, and it's amazing to me still how many hiring managers, especially, just go in and shoot from their hip, talk about themselves and maybe the company
Right.
for 20 minutes, and then give the applicant 10 minutes of tell me about yourself. And you come away, and the applicant who's ready for that performs really well. The applicant who wasn't ready for that approach and wanted something, more structured so that you could get the consistent information, they come off completely different
Right.
on the page. And so the structural interviews, and I think the book has really good tools for thinking through. If you go through your whole process, you've identified those. I think where a lot of managers get too clever is when they're writing those structured interview questions, they kind of play gotcha. And they see the interview sometimes as more of an interrogation or trying to catch the person in a lie rather than just a conversation where we can learn about each other and
Right.
and have this walk away as
Right.
both of us maybe knowing if this is a good fit or not.
And sometimes that is a criticism of the structured interviews is they can start to feel a little impersonal, and yeah, it can be, oh, I'm looking for the things that they don't know, and it's kind of a gotcha thing. So it can hurt the relationship building and stuff during the process. And there, I think it's really important for, as you're implementing this, to have interviewer training. And the interviewer training is not just some broad kind of interviewer training. It's working with interviewers specifically. And so they're able to follow the instructions, but they're also able to navigate the other things in the interview besides the asking the question and evaluating the answers.
And I see a lot of often angry posts on Reddit or other social media about employers who, maybe after the interview, hopefully at least, give candidates a fairly large, 6 to 8 hour project to complete to demonstrate that they've actually got these competencies, whether it's, a presentation or whatever.
Right.
And often they seem totally unrelated to whatever the candidate's role really would be. What are your thoughts on those kind of real world projects that
Right.
companies sometimes send applicants back to work on?
I get it. And some of the times I'm absolutely advocating for those types of things, but to ask an applicant to spend a lot of time is completely unfair. And I don't think companies should be in the business of doing that. But at the end of this process, you need to know not just, okay, this is my top candidate, but I think companies should also be able to articulate why. And so why is this person the best candidate for us? Why are they the most qualified candidate for us? And when I say most qualified, I mean the person who is the highest likelihood of succeeding in this job. So, and you brought up, the whole notion of go with your gut earlier. And I remember I hired my first person a number of years ago, and that's what I was told is at the end of the process, then just go with your gut, go with who you're most comfortable with. And I'm thinking, well, I'm an organizational psychologist. We tried to turn this into more of a, kind of a scientific kind of thing. And then at the end of it, you're telling me just to go with my gut.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was a bad idea then, and I think it's even worse idea now. Don't just go with your gut. You need to be able to articulate why. And some of the times at the end of the interview, it becomes clear. Okay, I interviewed 5 people. There was one person, and I think at that point, you go make that offer. And then there are other times where there are 3 people, and in the hiring manager's eyes, they're tied, and sometimes we'll talk, and you can talk them through. Let's evaluate these people, and maybe there is a best person, and they just needed somebody to bounce some ideas off of. But some of the times, I recommend a role play assessment. But when I say a role play assessment, it can't be this onerous, time-consuming process for the candidate. They've already probably gone through the process, which is weeks, probably a month in a lot of cases, and they've probably done well in the interviews. You just have 2 people at that point, and you need to be able to say, I'm going to hire this person and not that person, and why. And so for me, that becomes, I need more information. It's there. I don't have enough information at that point. So one of the things I've started doing is helping companies at that stage in the process too, at the very end stage when they've got 2 or 3 people and they just need more information. And I say, we can run them through a quick role play that is, interesting and provocative enough to, in all likelihood, differentiate between the people, but will take an hour or less of the candidate's time. So we're not taking advantage of them, because in that case, there is one group that has power, which is the hiring organization, and one group that is, kind of subservient, and you can't take advantage of the candidates like that.
I think increasingly candidates aren't willing to. I mean, it's they'll move on. We've still got fairly low unemployment right now, and they'll just find the next role. There's so much more in the book. You talk about cultural fit. You talk about onboarding. And so I really do recommend that everybody go get a copy of A Better Choice. We'll share the links to get it in the show notes. But that's all the time we have today. Thanks for joining me, Mark.
Thanks, Mike.
And thank you for listening. You can comment on this episode or search our previous episodes at goodmorninghr.com or on Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. And don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Rob Upchurch is our technical producer, and you can reach him at robmakespods.com. And thank you to Marianne Hernandez, Imperatives Marketing Coordinator, who keeps the trains running on time. And I'm Mike Coffey, as always. Don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.